Okay, so today we're diving into this pretty intense situation that went down in the Oval Office.
Yeah, President Trump's meeting with Zelensky.
Right, it's like a political thriller playing out on the world stage with these two leaders just going head to head.
It was definitely more than a disagreement.
Oh, absolutely.
There were some pretty fundamental differences in their personalities, their strategies, even their worldview that were all on full display.
And it seems like at the core of it all is this tension surrounding the U.S.'s continued support for the war. Zelensky is basically pleading for it, going as far as criticizing past U.S. administrations for not doing enough.
Right, and those pleas are happening at a really interesting time because President Trump has been sending pretty clear signals about wanting a quick end to this conflict.
Oh, yeah, he's been pushing for a negotiated settlement, emphasizing the downsides of this dragging on.
Exactly.
And that's what makes Zelensky's public outbursts so fascinating and kind of risky, this open criticism of the U.S.
It's a dangerous game, for sure. I mean, by publicly challenging President Trump questioning America's commitment, he risks alienating the very people he needs to win over.
It seems like it could backfire and push President Trump even further towards ending the war, but on his terms.
That's a real possibility.
And let's not forget, President Trump isn't exactly mincing words. He keeps reminding Zelensky of just how much Ukraine relies on U.S. support.
He's laying out the power dynamics very clearly and highlighting Ukraine's vulnerability, essentially saying, look, Zelensky, you don't have much leverage here.
So in a way, he's dictating the terms of any potential peace deal.
It certainly seems that way.
And what about Europe? It seems like they're caught in a tough spot.
Definitely. They're watching this unfold with a lot of anxiety, but they're also hesitant to rock the boat with the U.S.
Right. They don't want to jeopardize their relationship with America by siding too strongly with Ukraine.
It seems their priority is maintaining those transatlantic ties.
And then we have Putin observing this whole thing from the sidelines. And from his recent speech, he actually sounds pretty optimistic about President Trump's approach.
Yeah, it's an interesting development Putin sees in President Trump, someone who's pragmatic, maybe willing to move past those old Cold War disagreements.
So maybe he sees an opportunity to strike a deal that aligns with President Trump's vision for the region.
It's possible.
Which is quite a departure from what we've been hearing from him before.
Yes, it is.
But is all of this really just about Ukraine, or is there something bigger going on here?
Well, if we step back and look at the big picture, President Trump's push for peace in Ukraine seems connected to his other foreign policy goals.
Like containing China.
Right, and renegotiating those arms control agreements. Things that get a lot more complicated with this war still raging.
So peace in Ukraine would free him up to focus on those other priorities.
Exactly.
And that's why this confrontation is so significant. It's not just about Ukraine. It could have huge implications, with President Trump basically saying Zelensky isn't ready for peace on social media.
Yeah, talk about a dramatic exit.
Oh, what does peace on President Trump's terms actually look like? What would it take?
Well, based on what we're seeing from our sources, there are some key elements that seem to be non-negotiable for Russia.
Okay, like what?
Well, first off, Ukraine would have to adopt a neutral stance. No NATO membership, no Western security guarantees.
That's a pretty huge concession.
Yeah, it is. And there's more. Accepting the annexation of Crimea, along with the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson oblasts would be another big one.
Wow, those are significant regions.
They give Russia that land-bridged Crimea and control over some vital resources.
And then there's a demilitarization issue.
Right, essentially reducing Ukraine's military capabilities to the point where they can't pose any kind of offensive threat to Russia.
So what would that actually involve?
It's still a bit unclear, but we're talking potential limits on troop size, types of weaponry, military exercises, that kind of thing.
Those are some pretty tough demands for Zelensky to swallow. How's the Ukrainian military reacting to all of this?
Well, there's definitely a possibility of resistance within the ranks.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I mean, they've been fighting so hard for so long. A peace deal that feels like a betrayal could really crush their morale.
And wouldn't that just play right into Putin's hands? A demoralized, fractured Ukraine?
It's a real concern. But on the other hand, President Trump's hardline stance could actually push Zelensky towards accepting a deal, even if it's one he doesn't like.
So it's a gamble. A high-stakes one.
Absolutely. And it's not just putting pressure on Zelensky, it's putting pressure on the Europeans, too.
Right. They're stuck between wanting to stay in President Trump's good graces and, their concerns about Russia getting even more aggressive.
Exactly.
And speaking of Europe, they don't seem too eager to challenge President Trump on any of this.
No, they're treading very carefully.
I mean, they understand that if the U.S. completely disengages from Europe, it leaves them extremely vulnerable.
Right. They rely heavily on NATO, on that U.S. security umbrella.
So it's like they're prioritizing their relationship with the U.S. over their commitment to Ukraine.
It appears that way.
So essentially, they're ready to go along with whatever President Trump decides, even if it means leaving Ukraine out in the cold.
That's the likely scenario.
We talked earlier about Putin seeming pretty happy with President Trump's approach. What is it about President Trump that gives him this confidence?
Well, Putin sees President Trump as someone who understands realpolitik.
You know, like deals based on cold, hard interests rather than ideology.
Right. He sees a leader who's willing to negotiate, who understands power dynamics.
So maybe he thinks this is a chance to strike a grand bargain.
Exactly. One that reshapes the entire security landscape of Europe, recognizes Russia's sphere of influence.
And lets President Trump focus on his other priorities.
Right. Potentially bringing some stability to the region. But that stability would come at a steep price for Ukraine.
No doubt Zelensky's caught between a rock and a hard place. Either he accepts a deal that cedes territory and sovereignty, or he risks even more fighting and potentially even greater losses.
It's a truly agonizing decision.
This whole situation really shows just how much power the U.S. presidency holds. The decisions of one person can have these massive ripple effects across the globe.
It's a stark reminder that we live in a world where power dynamics are constantly in flux, and the fate of entire nations can hinge on the actions of a few individuals.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful, but it still feels like we're just scratching the surface.
There are so many unknowns, so many potential consequences to think about. This is far from over.
We've been focusing on the immediate fallout from this clash between President Trump and Zelensky. But what about the bigger picture? What are the long-term implications for the global order?
We'll look at the possibility of a new security architecture in Europe, the role of China in all of this, and the lasting impact of this conflict.
So we've been really digging into this whole Trump-Zelensky showdown.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's becoming clear that this isn't just about Ukraine.
Right. This goes way beyond Ukraine.
Yeah.
What we're seeing is a symptom of a much bigger shift, a reshaping of the global balance of power.
Like we're moving away from that post-Cold War order.
Exactly. We're seeing the U.S., Russia, China all kind of jostling for position, trying to assert their dominance.
And Ukraine, unfortunately, is stuck right in the middle of this geopolitical tug of war.
Exactly. It's become a proxy conflict.
Yeah.
Each of these major players using it to advance their own agendas.
And the problem for Ukraine is that their fate is ultimately in the hands of these global powers.
Right.
So where does this leave Zelensky? I mean, he's facing all this pressure from President Trump to accept a deal that a lot of people would see as surrendering to Russia. But if he refuses, he risks losing U.S. support completely.
It's a no-win situation, really.
Yeah.
The choice between a bad deal and a potentially worse outcome.
A true test of his leadership.
Absolutely a defining moment for Ukraine.
And the European nations, you know, they seem pretty content to just let President Trump call the shots, even if it means throwing Ukraine on the bus.
Well, they're in a tough spot. I mean, they understand just how reliant they are on the U.S. for their security.
Yeah.
And they're not about to risk that relationship by pushing back too hard against President Trump.
So basically, realpolitik wins again.
It seems that way, national interest taking priority over any moral obligation to support Ukraine.
It's a harsh reality, but I guess that's how the world works sometimes.
It's a common theme in international relations, for sure.
But maybe there's a silver lining here. If President Trump can actually pull off a deal with Russia, could that lead to more stability in Europe?
It's possible, but any deal is going to come at a cost.
Right.
And Ukraine is likely to pay the price.
And we have to remember, even if they do reach an agreement, it's not going to magically solve everything.
Oh, of course not.
Yeah.
The underlying tensions, the rivalries that fueled this conflict, they're not going to just disappear overnight.
This is just one chapter in a much longer story.
Exactly. The struggle for power and influence that's going to continue. We're going to see new flashpoints emerge.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening.
It has.
It shows just how complex the world really is. Alliances, shifting interests, clashing, the fate of nations hanging in the balance.
But it also shows that individual actions can have a huge impact. The choices leaders make, the actions they take, can have profound consequences for all of us.
As we try to make sense of this ever-changing landscape, it's more important than ever to stay informed,
Absolutely.
to analyze information, critically question our assumptions.
Couldn't agree more.
This clash between President Trump and Zelensky might seem like an isolated incident, but it really speaks to a much deeper shift in the global order.
Right. The old rules are breaking down and new power dynamics are emerging.
The big question is, are we ready for what comes next? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most critical moments in international relations. We'll be back soon to explore more of the forces shaping our world. Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.